Okay, so I have a question to kick things off today, and I want you to be honest.
Uh-oh. Okay, I'm ready.
When you hear the phrase being saved, especially, in a religious context, what is the very first image that pops into your head?
Well, it's easy. It's likely a church service, probably an altar call,
Yeah.
maybe just specific prayer being recited.
Right. It's almost always framed as this spiritual transaction, a moment between you and the divine, something happening internally.
Sure.
But what if that definition is? Well, what if it's incomplete? Or at least, what if it's missing the half of the equation that the original authors actually cared about the most?
You're suggesting it's not just about the soul.
I'm looking at our source material today, and it's suggesting that being saved might have as much to do with your bank account as it does with your prayer life.
That is a provocative opener. But looking at the stack of notes we have for this deep dive, you are absolutely spot on.
So what are we looking at?
We are digging into a transcript from a lecture series. It's titled Covenant Community Demand Lecture, Acts and Pauline Theology. And I have to say, this isn't your standard Sunday school refresher course.
Not at all. It's a pretty radical rereading of the New Testament, specifically the books of Luke and Acts.
Right?
So the mission for this deep dive is to uncover what the lecturer calls the Jubilee framework.
The Jubilee. That is the key word for today, isn't it?
It is. The argument here is that the early church wasn't just a group of people who believed the same spiritual dogmas. They were a radical economic movement.
An engine of debt release and wealth redistribution.
Exactly. And that not just the preaching was why they absolutely exploded in growth.
It changes the whole texture of the story. Instead of just a religious club, you're looking at a survival network.
But to get there, we have to start where the lecturer starts. And he starts with a complaint, really, about how we typically read the Bible.
A structural complaint, yeah.
Yeah.
He says we have this bad habit of chopping the story in half. We read the Gospel of Luke as a biography of Jesus. Then we flip over to the book of Acts and read it as a history of the apostles. Two separate books, two separate vibes.
And they're usually separated by the Gospel of John in most Bibles, just to make sure we keep them apart physically.
Exactly. But the source insists this is, just dead wrong. He argues they are one single, continuous work. He calls it Luke Acts.
Hyphenated.
Hyphenated, one volume, two parts. He actually challenges his students to do this physical exercise, which I think is great. He tells them to take a stack of A4 paper and just write a summary flow from Luke chapter 1 straight through to Acts chapter 19.
Just map it all out.
Just map it out on paper. And what happens when you do that?
You stop seeing two stories.
And you start seeing one arc. It's not Jesus does stuff and then the apostles do stuff. It's Jesus teaches a method and then...
Acts is the execution of that method.
Precisely.
And there's a statistic in here that really puts this in perspective. I hadn't realized this before, but it makes total sense when you say it.
The word count.
Yes. If you look at the original Greek text, Luke Acts makes up about 27.5% of the entire New Testament.
Which is just math.
It's roughly a third. We usually think of the New Testament as being, dominated by Paul, right? Because he wrote so many letters. But in terms of sheer volume, this one author, Luke, is responsible for a massive chunk of the Christian canon.
Which means if you miss the unified vision of this one author, you are missing the context for a third of the New Testament. You're missing the forest for the trees.
So if we accept the premise that this is one big book, not two small ones, what is the thread tying them together? Because the source is very specific about this.
It's the Jubilee, the year of release.
Okay, for those who might be a bit rusty on their Old Testament Levitical law, give us the explain like I'm five on the Jubilee.
So in ancient Israelite law, every 50 years, the slate was wiped clean.
A total reset.
A total reset. If you had sold your land because you were poor, you got it back. If you had sold yourself into slavery to pay a debt, you were freed. It was a societal reset button to prevent permanent poverty and a permanent upper class.
A massive economic equalizer.
Exactly. Now, fast forward to Luke chapter 4. Jesus stands up in the synagogue to start his public ministry. He reads from Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim liberty to the captives.
To proclaim the year of the Lord's favor.
That is the Jubilee. He is announcing the year of release. Now, traditionally, we spiritualize that. We say, oh, he means freedom from the captivity of sin.
Which is true, presumably, in the theology.
Sure, but the source argues Jesus meant it literally as well. He was launching a movement based on that economic reset, and this is the key link to the book of Acts.
Because in Acts, we see the church actually doing it.
Precisely.
Yeah.
We all know those famous verses in Acts.
Yeah.
All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need.
Right. And usually we treat that as this weird, spontaneous moment. Like the Holy Spirit came at Pentecost, everyone got super emotional and excited, and they just decided to share their lunch.
A hippie commune moment that fizzled out.
Yeah.
Right. A spontaneous outburst of generosity.
Yeah.
But the lecturer says, no, absolutely not. This wasn't an accident. This was the result of training. Think about the flow of Luke Acts again. For the entire Gospel of Luke, Jesus is intensively training the disciples in this Jubilee lifestyle. He's teaching them to let go of possessions, to trust for daily bread, to give to the poor.
So when you get to Acts and they start selling their land,
They're just executing the play they've been practicing for 3 years.
Acts is the graduation ceremony of the Jubilee Training School.
Exactly.
Okay, I want to drill down on this because the source uses a specific story to prove this point. And it's a story everyone knows or thinks they know. Zacchaeus.
Ah, yes. The wee little man in the sycamore tree.
It's a staple of children's Bibles. Short guy, tax collector, climbs a tree. Jesus comes over for dinner. They sing a song. The end.
But the source says, ignore the tree. Look at the money.
The money is the main character in the scene.
It really is.
Yeah.
I mean, set the scene. Zacchaeus is a chief tax collector.
Here.
In that context, he's not just an IRS agent. He's a collaborator with the Roman occupier.
Right.
He's wealthy because he's extorting his own neighbors. He is the opposite of the Jubilee. He is the accumulation of wealth through oppression.
So he meets Jesus. He welcomes him joyfully. But the climax of the story isn't a prayer. It isn't a hymn. It's a financial statement.
It is. Zacchaeus stands up and makes a legally binding pledge. He says, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor.
That's not all.
No, he has, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount.
Let's just do the math on that for a second. Half his net worth gone immediately, and then 400% restitution on the fraud.
He's essentially bankrupting himself. He's liquidating his entire estate.
He is performing a personal jubilee. He is releasing what he hoarded.
And this is the aha moment the lecturer points out. When does Jesus say the word salvation?
Only after the money is on the table.
Right. Jesus says, today salvation has come to this house. The source argues that in Luke's theology, you cannot separate the two. Salvation isn't just an internal feeling. It is inextricably tied to the practice of economic release.
That is a heavy concept. It implies that if Zacchaeus had said, Jesus, I believe in you in my heart, but kept all the money.
Then according to this framework, salvation hadn't come to that house yet.
Wow. That really redefines the terminology.
It does. And it illuminates a very specific phrase in Acts. Later on, Acts describes the growth of the church by saying, the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved.
So in this context, those being saved were people who were joining a community where they had to, sign over their private property.
Correct. Joining the saved meant joining the economy of sharing. It wasn't just, I agree with your theology. It was, I am merging my life and my assets with yours.
And the source points out the flip side of this too. The story of Ananias and Sapphira.
The couple who dropped dead.
Yeah, Acts chapter 5. They sell a field, give some money to the apostles, but they keep a secret stash for themselves.
And usually that's taught as a lesson about lying. Don't lie to the Holy Spirit, which is true, of course.
Sure.
But in the Jubilee framework, their sin was trying to have it both ways. They wanted the status of the saved community, the community of total sharing, without actually paying the price of the Jubilee.
They were faking the economic commitment. They were trying to hedge their bets.
And in a community that relies on total mutual dependence, hedging your bets is a fatal flaw. It breaks the system. If I'm trusting you for my food and you're hoarding yours.
The community collapses.
Right.
It's fascinating how much this focuses on the structure of the community. Which brings me to the author himself. We mentioned Luke wrote 27.5% of the New Testament. But who was he? Because the source makes a big deal about his background.
This is crucial. Luke wasn't Jewish. He was a Gentile. Likely a Greek intellectual, a physician, probably from Antioch.
So he's an outsider. He wasn't one of the original 12 disciples. He didn't walk around Galilee with Jesus.
No. He came to it later. And the source suggests we should view Luke almost like an anthropologist. He's looking at this early Christian movement with fresh eyes.
And what does he see?
He sees something that just shouldn't exist. You have to remember the Roman world. It was a rigid hierarchy. Patronage, status, property, that was everything.
If you had money, you flaunted it. If you didn't, you starved.
And suddenly, here's this group of people, Jews and Gentiles, slaves and free, who are saying, nothing I own is mine.
It shocked him.
The source suggests Luke was captivated by it. He's thinking, humans don't act like this. This is impossible.
So his motivation for writing Luke Acts wasn't just to record history, it was to document this phenomenon.
Exactly. And the source argues that this lifestyle, this wordless evangelism, was the primary tool for the church's growth.
Wordless evangelism. I like that term. But why was it necessary? Why not just preach on street corners?
Because of the timeline. We're talking about the era of Nero and later Domitian. This was a
Yeah.
time of intense persecution.
Right.
Standing on a street corner with a megaphone wasn't just annoying, it was suicidal. Verbal preaching could get you killed.
So how does a movement grow to eventually cover, 10% of the Roman Empire when it's illegal to talk about it?
By acting it out. The source argues people were converted by seeing the Jubilee in action. They saw believers who faced death without fear.
Okay.
But even more confusing to the Roman mind, they saw people who shared their assets without hesitation.
It's the ultimate counterculture. In a world of greed is good, radical generosity is the most disruptive thing you can possibly do.
And the source draws a direct line from this early church practice all the way to the rise of monasticism later in history.
Yeah.
Monks taking vows of poverty.
Mm.
That didn't come out of nowhere. It was the continuation of this Luke Acts DNA. The impulse to give up property and live communally was preserved in the monasteries when the rest of the world moved on.
Speaking of moving on, I want to pivot to the leadership that made this possible. The source shifts focus to the Apostle Paul. And again, it challenges the traditional image we have of him.
Oh, absolutely.
We know Paul was a tent maker. I think most people hear that and think, okay, he had a day job. He was a freelancer to pay the bills.
A side hustle.
Right. But the lecturer says it was much deeper than that. It wasn't just economics. It was sociology. It was about downward mobility.
This brings us to a term the source uses, the Habiru.
Habiru. That sounds like the root for Hebrew.
It is related linguistically, but in the ancient Near East, Habiru referred to a social class, or rather a lack of class. It meant the underclass, the refugees, the migrants, the people at the very bottom who had no legal standing.
The invisible people.
The invisible people, exactly. Now look at Paul. He was an elite. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees, a Roman citizen, which was a huge deal. He was educated.
Right.
For a man of his status to sit down and work with leather and goat hair manual labor wasn't just hard work.
It was a humiliation.
It was a massive social demotion. In the Roman mind, manual labor was for slaves.
So he was choosing to live as a Habiru. He was choosing to become the underclass.
Yes. The source emphasizes that for an upper-class intellectual like Paul, this was physically and socially exhausting. But he did it intentionally. He couldn't preach to the masses from a pedestal. He had to embody their life.
The source uses a really vivid analogy here involving Moses that I absolutely loved. It's so human.
It's a great comparison. Think about Moses. He spends the first 40 years of his life as a prince of Egypt.
The peak of civilization. The finest linen, the best food, daily baths, servants.
And he flees to Midian. And he spends the next 40 years as a shepherd in the desert.
And the lecturer, I love this detail, he muses about the hygiene.
Yes, it's a hilarious but real detail, isn't it?
It is. He talks about how jarring that transition must have been, going from Egyptian baths to, living in a tent with sheep. He even mentions his own experience in primitive mission fields, realizing, wait, did I brush my teeth today?
It sounds funny, but the point is so profound. When you are surviving, the niceties of civilization just vanish you because Hiru, you smell like the sheep.
But why is that necessary? Why couldn't Moses lead Israel from the palace? Why couldn't Paul lead the church as a wealthy patron?
Because, as the source puts it, God solves problems from the bottom up. You cannot fix the Habiru problem, the problem of the oppressed, from the top down.
You have to be in it.
You have to be in it. Moses had to smell like sheep to lead the shepherds. Paul had to have calloused hands to reach the workers. True authority in this Jubilee kingdom comes from shared suffering, not from a title.
That is such a challenge to our modern idea of leadership. We usually think of leadership as climbing the ladder, getting out of the mess.
And this model says, no, you climb down the ladder into the mess.
So we have this radical economic lifestyle. We have leaders practicing downward mobility. But how did it actually spread? Because the source mentions that the expansion of the church wasn't exactly a corporate strategy rollout.
Far from it. If you were looking for a strategic plan, you wouldn't find one. The source is very clear. The expansion was driven by persecution.
So it was an accident or a reaction?
It was a refugee crisis.
Yeah.
Look at Acts chapter 8. Stephen is the first martyr he's killed, and immediately a massive persecution breaks out. Believers in Jerusalem run for their lives.
They aren't going on a planned missionary journey with a support letter and a budget.
No, they are fleeing with the clothes on their backs.
Yeah.
They are losing their homes, their jobs, their stability. They go to Judea, Samaria, as far as Antioch.
But here's the kicker. The source says that is how the message spread.
Exactly, they were scattered.
Yeah.
But they carried this Jubilee virus, this lifestyle of sharing and survival with them. Because they were refugees, they needed each other. The community structure wasn't a luxury. It was the only way they survived.
And the source breaks down the demographics of who these people were, which I found really insightful. He distinguishes between the crowd at Pentecost in Acts 2 and the crowd later in Acts 4.
This is a detail I had missed for years. In Acts 2, you have 3,000 converts. But the source notes these were mostly diaspora Jews.
Okay, explain diaspora for us.
These are Jews who lived outside of Israel, in Rome, Greece, Asia Minor. They were in Jerusalem as tourists, essentially, for the Pentecost festival.
So they convert, they learn the message.
And then they go home. They take the seed back to their home cities. That's the first wave.
But then in Acts 4 at Solomon's Port, there are another 5,000 converts.
And the source argues these were likely local Jerusalem residents because it wasn't a festival time anymore.
So now you have a massive local population buying in.
Exactly. It shows that the sharing lifestyle was working on the ground in the city day to day. It wasn't just a festival high. It was a sustainable, if radical, way of life.
And the lecture highlights that the leaders of this expansion, people like Barnabas, Stephen, and Paul, were all from that diaspora background.
Right. The original 12 disciples, Peter, John, James, they were local Galileans. They were essential witnesses. They were culturally local.
Sure.
To take this message to the world, you needed people who understood the Greco-Roman mind. You needed bridge builders.
But again, the engine crossing that bridge wasn't just good arguments. It was this radical community life.
Always.
So let's pull back. We've covered a lot of ground here. We've gone from Luke and Acts being one unified manifesto to the economic definition of salvation. We've looked at downward mobility and refugee expansion. What is the big picture here?
The big picture is that we often misunderstand the power of the early church. We think it succeeded because of miracles or because the arguments were undeniable. And the source doesn't deny those things.
Sure.
But it argues that the structural power, the thing that made the Roman Empire take notice and eventually worry, was this radical economic system, the Jubilee.
They redefined salvation not just as I'm going to heaven when I die, but as I am responsible for your well-being right now.
A community where poverty was eliminated because ownership was relinquished, that is a dangerous idea to an empire built on accumulation.
It's a dangerous idea to our modern society, too, frankly. It's hard to swallow. It suggests you can't really claim the theology without the practice.
It suggests that your bank statement is a theological document.
Oof, that stings a little.
It's meant to.
And that brings us to the final thought I want to leave our listeners with today. The source raised this really provocative question about leadership that has been stuck in my head.
About the bottom.
Right. We talked about Paul and Moses going to the bottom to lead experiencing the life of the Hupweru.
The manual labor, the refugee status, the hunger.
So here is the question. If the early church leaders had to experience the bottom life to be effective, what does that say about how we view success in leadership today?
Can you truly help the people at the bottom if you've never lived there yourself?
Is empathy enough? Or does it require incarnation?
That is the question.
Something to mull over. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Jubilee. We'll see you next time.